Welcome to Fairy Tale Access, where the head fairy's quest is to prove that fairy tales do exist in actual time rather than once upon a time. Together, we will unravel the heroes, young and old, who turn dreams into reality. These are the people who still believe in happily ever after. The discoveries will bend even our most cynical non-believers into believing in fairy tales. Hi, welcome to Fairy Tale Access. Today, I am excited to introduce you to the author, Greg Hickey of Parabellum. This is such a shocking crime novel. And if you love crime novels, you'll enjoy this one. Let's find out how he did it. Hi, thank you for joining us, Greg.
Hi, Denise Marie. It's a wonderful pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. Okay, how did you write this story? And not to give too much away, but all the suspects in the story, through most of the book, we don't even know their names. So,
Sure.
tell me,
Go ahead.
why did you approach it that way?
You mean with the names?
Without the names, yeah.
So, I think there are two things going on with the novel. One is it is a crime novel, so readers are asked to look at each of the suspects and think about how and why each of them might have been involved in this mass shooting incident that occurs at the beginning of the book. So there's a little bit of that whodunit aspect. The other part of it is because we're talking about a mass shooting, which is something that has been going on a lot in America in the past decade or so, we're dealing with my approach to covering these incidents. And I think the way they've been covered in the past has been oftentimes erroneous and often leads to kind of encouraging potential mass shooters to continue to commit these crimes. Because a lot of times the way the media does that is they will say, name of the shooter, killed 50 people, which is a record or something like that. And it ends up sort of aggrandizing these crimes and building the shooter up so that, people who might have an inkling if they want to commit a similar crime see the attention that these crimes get and are more compelled to do so. So one of the reasons I wanted to kind of steer away from names is to say, yes, we're dealing with something that, goes on in society and it's important to talk about, but I also don't want to commit some of the same fallacies that I think popular media commits when they cover these crimes.
I think he definitely did that, taking us through all of the suspects, determining what was going on in their heads during the time. It was really horrifying. They could be people that you knew. And then I really enjoyed the way that you bring out the victims.
Yeah, I did.
It was just like it's like grabs your heart and it just squeezes and twists.
Yeah, there was definitely a little bit at the end of the story sort of highlighting some of the victims because, again, I think those are often the people that don't get covered when mass shootings occur in real life. A lot of the focus is on the killer and why he or she did it. And then, the victims maybe get one article and they're sort of brushed aside and the investigation continues into the shooter's motives and so forth. And it's gut-wrenching when you go back and you read some of these real-life stories of the victims and, the dreams they had and the places they were in their life and, what they were looking forward to doing. And not just hear about their lives cut short is tragic, really. And it's a shame that, the killer continues to be built up and continues to get coverage and the victims are just sort of swept under the rug.
So to get into your mindset of how you set this up, tell me a little bit about your background. Do you have a day job or are you a full-time writer?
No, I have a day job. I am a forensic scientist for the Illinois State Police. So I work in a crime lab in Chicago and I work in a section that deals with gun crimes. So I get firearms and cartridge cases and bullets from crime scenes. And my job is to analyze the bullets and cartridge cases and try to determine whether or not they were fired by a particular gun.
Wow, that's cool.
It is. It's a very cool job. Yeah.
When did you have time to write this?
So for this one, I did most of my writing during my commute to and from work, on my lunch breaks, at evenings when I got home, and a lot of times on the weekends. So I would kind of work during the week and just try to write as much as I could in the time that I had. A lot of times I was writing longhand in a notebook at lunch or on my commute. Sometimes I'd be typing directly into my phone in a note-taking app. And then Friday and Saturday, I would try to compile all the work I'd done during the week, put it into a Word document, and start building out a draft, and then adding to that draft if I had some extra time on the weekend.
How long did it take you to write?
It took me about a year probably to get a rough draft done, and then maybe another year or so of edits and further refining the story.
How did you get inside the suspect's head? Because these suspects and what they were going through, the little hints that were in their background to make them suspects in the first place, and then finding out who the killer was and whether or not you guessed right, was really good. It was really laid out extremely well. Is that from your work?
Well, thank you, first of all. I think my work plays a part in that I have, some knowledge of guns and how they're used, and how you can disassemble them, and calibers and basic terminology with guns. So I have some familiarity that allowed me to make, I think, those parts of the novel hopefully pretty accurate. As far as the characters, I really did want to kind of allow myself and allow the readers to empathize with the characters, to understand what they're going through, even if they don't, or hopefully don't, eventually condone the way the characters turn out and condone the fact that they are all predisposed to commit violence. So there are two kind of basic forms of research I did in order to come up with the characters, in order to structure them throughout the novel. So I read a lot about historical mass shootings and accounts of evil, books like Dave Cullen's book, Columbine, which is a true crime account of the shooting at Columbine High School, Masters of Death by Richard Rhodes, which is a historical account of Nazi extermination squads who would basically follow the Nazi army throughout Europe and round up all these villagers and just, shoot them to death by a mass firing squad. And so that kind of gave me a framework for how a person could turn from, a relatively normal person into this just indiscriminate murderer. And so it kind of gave me a framework for, the progression I wanted to see for each of these characters throughout the story. But I knew I also wanted these characters to have, specific psychological conditions and issues that were particular to each character. And so I needed to do some research into those as well. So I, read books on psychopathy, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, CTE, or chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is basically a disease that a lot of professional football players get when they have too many head injuries as a result of all that contact. And I also read a lot of memoirs, so books that were written by people dealing with some of these issues, and that really helped me give me some good language to describe the characters and describe what they were feeling in a way that I hope is not just kind of glossing over the surface or playing off some pretty common tropes of what depression is like or what PTSD is like.
No, I was astounded. It kept me really reeled in, even though I was horrified to read it because it was so realistic. You're right. You did take a different angle than the news. And I think that's what made it a better story than what we hear about in the news. Because you really want to know what these people are like, but we don't want to know their name. I want to know the victims. And I want to know what was going on that day before everything happened. And you really covered that and tied it all in exceptionally well. So what about your background? You're an athlete. What are some of the things that you've done in the past that added the adrenaline to this book?
Oh, that's a good question. So I played a lot of sports throughout most of my life. kind of the peak of my athletic career, I guess I was mainly a baseball player. So I played baseball in high school and in college. When I graduated from college, I was fortunate enough to be able to play for about a year overseas in Sweden and South Africa. And then when I got home to Chicago and started grad school, I started getting into endurance sports. So I run a few marathons. I've done some triathlons. And so I'm not consciously, I don't know how much that sort of adrenaline rush plays into my writing. I am very conscious of the fact that I do use a lot of examples from sports. I do use a lot of sports metaphors or comparisons to sports. I think in this book, what helped me the most is using my experience of an athlete, and especially an athlete, coming out of playing overseas and playing baseball in college and coming home and moving on to the next stage of my life. That was really helpful for me in writing the character of the ex-college athlete and the Army veteran. So, the ex-college athlete would be the character that is the most similar to me. This is a young woman who is a fantastic athlete, better than I was, who gets a scholarship to play at a Division I university. She's a soccer player and she's very talented, but she keeps having these head injuries that eventually force her to step away from the sport. And while I didn't have any injuries that forced me to quit playing baseball, I can kind of identify her because there was a point in my life where I realized, I'm not going to be able to do this anymore. I'm not going to be a professional baseball player. I'm not that good. I need to come home and get a real job and move on with my life. And so there is that piece for her of she's sort of losing part of her identity, what has defined her for many years of her life. And she has to grapple not only with her head injuries and the physical ailments that she suffers, but with the fact that she has to sort of try to redefine herself as she moves forward. And the Army...
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
The Army veteran is a similar character in some respects because he fought in the Iraq War. He was in a very high-pressure situations in Iraq, moving through ambushes and dealing with fighting insurgents. And he comes home, and now he's got to go back to civilian life. And from what I've read and heard from veterans who come back to civilian life after a very high-pressure deployment, one of the difficult things about adjusting is, dealing with going through life, not having that constant surge of adrenaline, and really knowing that you're never going to experience life at the same high stakes that you did for that brief short period. And so that is, I think, kind of similar to an athlete, giving up a sport and moving on to civilian life and realizing that a part of you that was used to competing and striving and training and pushing yourself physically and mentally, you still have that with you in small parts, but it's not quite the same thing.
Now, I imagine when you come back from those things, life slows down quite a bit. But
yeah,
did you take psychology too? Because you were really able to make the mental health issues come out without especially throwing them at the reader. You were helping us understand what these people were going through, from the military to the girl who used to play soccer, to just the way they thought about their work, their life, the way things were going on around them, the way their perceptions. That was so well done. So do you have psychiatry in there or something?
No, I don't. And thank you again. I was a philosophy major in college. So that may help a little bit. But my approach was really to try to, one, understand what it's like for people who are really going through these conditions. And really the memoirs that I read helped me a lot. Just being able to see how people going through these situations express themselves and the language they use and what I thought I could adopt and put into Parabellum. And then I also tried to take little pieces of me and insert them into all the characters. So I've never had PTSD. I've never fought in a war. I've never had clinical depression. I've never had enough head injuries that I would suffer CTE. But like I said, with the ex-athlete and the veteran, there are parts of me that I have, experienced some inkling of what they have. I've never been depressed, but I have suffered setbacks in my life, and I have had my share of disappointments. And, I'm not as completely emotionally detached as the computer programmer is, but I work in a field in forensics where I have to have some emotional detachment because I deal with crime scenes and what really turn out to be horrific stories, and I have to be able to kind of distance myself from what brought the evidence into my laboratory and just focus on dealing with the evidence. So, my approach was to try to use my experiences and use real people's experiences and put that into the work, and not try to interpret these conditions and try to guess at what they might be like.
Why did you decide not to give the suspects names?
So a part of it is
Until later.
Sure. So part of it, like I said, is that I wanted to strike a balance between understanding how someone could be driven to the point of committing mass murder without aggrandizing the people who would do such a thing. And I think there's also a second component, which is to say that Parabellum is really about a failure of empathy on all parts of the characters. So, the shooter, the eventual shooter, is the most obvious example, but there are instances throughout the book where characters either fail to understand people as well as they could, or themselves are victims of people failing to understand and empathize with them. So there's an instance where the computer programmer is involved in a car crash with a drunk driver. And, I think that's one example of failure of empathy, to be someone who, can go out and get drunk and decide, yes, I'm fine up to drive myself home and take the keys and get behind the wheel of the car without thinking about the consequences for other people. And we all have these failures of empathy in large or small parts throughout our lives. There are all moments where we would look back and wish that we could have been a little more understanding, a little more empathetic towards other people, and thought more about, what other people want and how our actions are infringing on what they want and what they deserve. And that's not to say this is a slippery slope argument. If you litter, if you drive drunk, the next step is you're going to be a mass killer. That's not true at all. But part of Parabellum, I think, is holding up a mirror to all of us and saying, can we empathize with these characters who are going to the very worst place in their lives? And can we kind of use that skill of empathy to look at ourselves and say, how can we be a little bit better people? How can we be a little bit more understanding?
That's what I liked about the book. It's one of those books that you're going to think about it long after it's done. Long after it's done. And the way that the characters come out, you're kind of angry with them at times for the choices that they make. But then once it's over, and once you see who the killer is, and the hope that you drop for us at the end is just that, taking that time to understand the people around us and listen a little bit more makes all the difference in the other suspects' lives and the choices they made that weren't the actual killers.
Yes, well, thank you. And it was important for me to try to end the book on a somewhat hopeful note. Obviously, it's a book about a mass shooting and people who are capable of committing a mass shooting. So it's a dark subject, and there are very dark moments in the book. And while I think the mass shooting happens at the beginning and it then flashes back and focuses on each of those characters, and at least I hope there's not too much violence or gore throughout the bulk of the story, it's still a very dark subject matter. And I wanted to say, this is something very serious that we're dealing with, and it's not just school shootings. It's the violence that goes on in cities in Chicago every day, and it's something that we have to deal with together. But I think there is a way forward, and I think we can find a better path forward.
How did you come up with the title Parabellum? Because it could mean, the semi-automatic pistol or machine gun, but in Latin, it's also related to, if you want peace, prepare for war.
Right, exactly. And so you hit on it exactly. It's a combination of the two. So the Latin phrase, si vis pacem parabellum, means if you want peace, you should prepare for war, which was then adopted into the name of a popular handgun cartridge, the 9mm Parabellum, which means prepare for war, or what's commonly known as the 9mm Luger in the United States. So there is that obvious connection with guns and with the handgun caliber cartridge. And then going back to the Latin quote, that quote really resonated with me as I prepared to write the novel, because I was kind of driven by this question, why do these mass shootings keep happening? What's going on with the shooters? How does someone go from, in a lot of cases, leading a pretty normal life to deciding that they're going to commit mass murder against these people that they don't even know and have no connection with? So I was seeking sort of this mental piece and understanding what was going on, but at the same time realizing that, I was in a sense preparing for war, and that I was going to go into some pretty dark places with my research and getting inside these characters' heads and writing this novel. That was going to require a lot of work before I could sort of achieve that satisfaction and that understanding.
Wow. For your research, did you use therapist opinions to help develop these characters to make them more relatable and understandable?
A lot of the sort of historical accounts that I read, and I read not only the book Columbine, but accounts of Sandy Hook shooting and the Virginia Tech shooting and the Las Vegas shooting. So a lot of those accounts deal with sort of psychological interpretations of what's going on with these murderers. So I drew on a lot of those interpretations, and then kind of looked at other semi-related crimes and brought in characters that I think could also be capable of committing mass violence.
And this is your first novel ever?
No, this is my third novel.
Your third? What were the other two about?
My first novel is a dystopian fiction called Our Dried Voices, which is about a future human society that takes place after humans have basically cured all diseases and solved world hunger and kind of slowed down global warming to the extent that things on Earth are relatively stable, and they discover a new planet and set up a colony there. And everything's going well in the colony. They set up machines that clean the colony and feed the colonists and basically take care of everything. And so the colonists can lead these sort of peacefully, blissful, ignorant lives. Everything's going well until the machines start to break down, and the colonists have to figure out how to think for themselves and how to survive again. And the second novel that I wrote was called The Friar's Lantern. It's told in the style of a choose-your-own-adventure. So for readers like me who grew up in the 80s and 90s, there was an original series called the Choose-Your-Own-Adventure books, where you, the reader, were the protagonist. You were the main character, and everything was written in the second person. So it'd say, you do this, you do that. And at certain points in the story, you, the reader, would have to make a choice and decide how the story continued. So the original series might say, if you choose to go down the dark path into the forest, turn to page 5. If you choose to go down the path towards the equally dark and scary cave, turn to page 10. You would turn to the corresponding page, and the story would continue. Well, The Friar's Lantern is sort of the grown-up version of those stories. So there's a lot of different threads going on. In one of the story threads, you engage in this scientific research experiment where you hook up to an MRI machine, and the machine tries to predict the decision that you're going to make a week later. And there's a lot of money involved, and you could end up very rich, but it raises questions about what's going on in your brain when you make decisions. And then in another main story thread, you're sort of on a jury trial, and you're assigned to this case where a professor is accused of killing the man that he believes murdered his wife a week after that original killing. And so you have to think about, why this professor committed the crime. Does he deserve blame for killing this man who he, was rightly enraged at, and how do we handle situations like that?
Well, that's deep, but this one almost read like John Grissom, sweeps you through, gives you all that really tight insights. You didn't miss a thing. It's amazing. What are you working on next?
No, I haven't really decided yet. I've been kicking around a few different ideas, and I think I'm going to kind of wait for Parabellum to come out, sort of clear my mind a little bit, let the dust settle, and then see what really grabs me next.
Great. So what should the reader get most out of this book before we go?
Well, hopefully they'll enjoy the story. My goal is always to write entertaining stories for smart readers. So I hope it's a book that, like you said, kind of pulls them in and pulls them along through the plot, and they, want to find out what happens next and want to try to guess at who commits these crimes. But it's also a book that I hope will kind of turn the mirror back on the reader and make the reader question, okay, how can I better understand people like this? How can I better understand what's going on around me? And how can I be a little bit more empathetic to the people around me and a little bit more understanding of people in my life?
Exactly. No, I think they will definitely get the message, because this is one story that I couldn't put down. And it really did bother me long after I read it.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing so much about how you got into this. It's amazing. And we'll look forward to seeing the next one. Until next time, keep asking questions. And if you want a great crime thriller, Parabellum by Hickey is definitely a gem. We'll see you soon.